The challenges come right from patient identification and trials, right? Because you're looking at sometimes rare diseases. So the commercialization strategies, the timeline, the patents, etc., all have to fall into place because if you're running a trial in a very niche condition, then you need to have the ecosystem to do that. That's, I guess, one major thing that happens in the early stages of clinical development / commercialization.
Hey, smart scientists. Welcome to another episode on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Developing cell and gene therapies and bringing them to patients is extremely challenging. And today we're talking exactly about that with Wajiha Ali, who is a strategy expert passionate about bridging the gap between research and commercialization. Stay tuned for an exciting conversation. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brohlman, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics at market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. Welcome, Wajiha, to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast.
Thank you for having me over. Really excited to be part of this conversation.
It's so good to have you on today. Share something that you believe about bioprocess development that most people disagree with.
I guess my hot take on bioprocess development would be that there are more countries in the world which have capabilities now to produce high quality biologics than what industry and regulators believe. I feel like that biologics have been around for decades now, and there is a lot of scientific as well as human resource development happening across the globe. And I think we should probably, as an industry, move towards exploring production in countries which are otherwise overlooked. Like I can give some examples, for example, Vietnam or some countries in Latin, or I would even say in Africa, etc. I think given the demographics and the infrastructure, I think it's prime to look out into creating high quality biologics out of these countries. So that's my hot take.
That's a great perspective. Yes, I've traveled a lot now in various parts of the world, and I do share that. Yes, I think we should look beyond the traditionally established countries. I think there's a lot going on outside, and high quality work is going on in other parts of the world. Wajiha, how did you get started in biotech, and what pivotal moments and decisions brought you to your current role?
I am a part of a strategy group within Daiichi Sankyo, which is a Japanese pharmaceutical company. This is actually my first pharma role because I've been on the consulting side all through my career. So I have a very non-traditional career path. I started my career as a pharmacist. Then I did a master's degree in pharmacology. And when I was at the crossroads of deciding whether to pursue a PhD or to start my professional career, I just took a leap of faith and essentially dove into the world of data analytics and intelligence. So I worked for a small company for 5 years wherein I learned the ins and outs of how the pharma industry works and what's the role of data in commercialization, medical affairs, and research. Subsequent to that, I continued my journey in the services side, joining a very niche boutique consulting firm, and wherein our focus was mainly on oncology. Again, we were servicing commercial and medical strategies, but we were coming in again from the consulting side of things. while I was there, I worked with the leading biologics companies from Amgen to Merck to Johnson and Johnson, worked on some of the leading drugs of today and also some very innovative early biotechs as well. And eventually, from my consulting days, I made a switch to pharma earlier, not too far back, because I felt like as I was looking at the next phase of my career and also like answering questions like what's going to be like the legacy, what do you want to leave behind, and where do you want to really have an impact, I felt like the industry basically gives me what I was looking for. So that's been my journey, and I wear very different hats. I work within R&D at this point, but I work within the R&D strategy. So I move between commercial to something like bioprocess and supply chain to clinical strategies to even, molecule design. So there's a lot of different hats that I wear, and I'm focused on breast cancer at the moment. And my past experience has been extensively in hematology and other indications.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love your story because I've now talked to a lot of different people on this podcast, and I see that most of the career paths are not linear. We start somewhere, we go to different places, and then end up where we are today. And that's highly fascinating. As we are now diving into the main topic today, Wajiha, I would just wanted to know, what is your take on what is the inherent complexity in developing cell and gene therapies today?
I think at the outset, I'd say that if you look at the scientific or the drug development landscape, cell and gene therapy literally come at the top end of complexity. And the complexity stems right from target selection and construct creation and actually coming up with the entity itself to clinical trials, because sometimes we're looking at very rare diseases. Sometimes we're looking at diseases wherein the traditional standards of care are very weak just because it's such an aggressive and a resilient disease. So we are looking at clinical development hurdles, which means that a lot of drugs have to be tried out before we land on winning asset, right? So I think that's the inherent complexity which exists in many diseases and many other biologics, but in cell and gene therapy, that's much more amplified because you're dealing with a complex system from the get-go. And I think the main complexity is the complexity of delivery. So we are essentially, especially if you take the case of autologous CAR T therapies, essentially the infrastructure that's needed, the manpower that is needed, the entire chain that is needed is extremely complex. And just to give a little summary to the listeners, for these CAR T therapies, essentially, we are looking at patients who are probably diagnosed in a community setting across the country or in a small healthcare system outside in Europe or in Asia. And essentially, they have to be referred into a accredited academic institution, which is essentially capable of providing them with the cell therapy. That itself is a hurdle because you're looking at transfer of data, decision making that spans multiple organizations, and then a very aggressive disease in many cases where you don't have the time to make these decisions. The second complexity comes when the patient is in the CAR T center itself. So there is conditioning regimens, there's prep before the patient's cells can be extracted and apheresed, and that requires some sort of a burden on the healthcare system as well. And then we essentially extract the cells, and the patient returns back to his or her home, and then the cells are sent to a third place, which is a manufacturing site. These manufacturing sites are not your average biological manufacturing site. They are specific sites for these therapies. And just to give an example, sometimes the regulation is so stringent in these places that the number of vials that these facilities can produce in a day is controlled, right? And this is all for a good reason, because you basically want to ensure that a system as delicate as this is handled with utmost care. But the oversight is to the degree that you count the number of vials that can be produced from a certain facility. That means to say it cannot be mass reproduced in different geographies just at the get-go. The third complexity comes from essentially when the product is created and there are some tests and validations done to ensure that it is exactly doing the job that it is intended to do, because this is hyper-personalized. You're taking from a patient, giving back to the same patient, and each dose, each vial, each drug is almost created like a new product. So the regular quality control mechanisms, etc., perhaps don't apply. There's more details that are required over here. Then moving back to the patient's journey, essentially the patient comes back into the healthcare system, is given the therapy. Here is where I think there's the good news that kicks in. These therapies are highly efficacious in many cases, right? So the patient will likely benefit from an efficacy standpoint, but there is a cloud of safety that's still looming, which leads to the last bit that I want to touch upon, which is essentially the monitoring of adverse events, which is not a simple thing like a rash that can just prescribe some cream and the patient goes back home. But this is actually a very severe condition that happens with some of these autologous cell therapies, and it's a condition called CRS. And I think the best explanation I give is think of it like a strong bout of COVID that can hit the patient anytime. So the symptoms are very similar, which means that the emergency rooms and the ICUs, etc., have to be ready in case the patient requires that level of hospitalization. On the flip side, the patient might not develop it, but you still need monitoring support. So the patient is still under the care of this particular academic center. And then hopefully after the symptoms are resolved, or after, if the patient does not develop, then they are sent back home and they should have a long remission or a treatment-free duration to the rest of their lifespan, which is the goal. So the complexity arises from there. And I'm not even touching about the launch or the regulatory at this point. I'm looking at it from a process and a patient journey. I know I spoke at length, but I wanted to give a sense to the listeners on how do we really, see this coming about in the clinic, and why when people say cell therapies and gene therapies are expensive, this is what's happening. And this is actually after trials, after the therapy has essentially shown some promise.
Yeah, smart biotech scientists, cell and gene therapies are complex. There's so much involved on the scientific, on the technical side, the way these are administered, the kinds of diseases that are treated. Now, besides the technical side, what other challenges do we face when we commercialize these therapies?
Yeah, I think the challenges come right from patient identification and trials, right? Because you're looking at sometimes rare diseases. So the commercialization strategies, the timeline, the patents, etc., all have to fall into place, because if you're running a trial in a very niche condition, then you need to have the ecosystem to do that. That's, I guess, one major thing that happens in the early stages of clinical development / commercialization. The second, I would say, thing is the infrastructure that you need to build. And this goes on as you're going through trials, etc. So essentially the bioprocess facilities that I spoke about, and having those academic centers in place, and that requires accreditation, that requires human resources, that requires regulation again, training, etc. So that's the commercialization bit. And I think the third hurdle, and which really is a very sobering realization sometimes, is that do we even need this kind of a complex therapy for these patients? So we're looking at non-cell therapy approaches, which to me is a very strong indicator of good commercial decision making, because do you really want to invest the time, the effort, the infrastructure into bringing something to the market wherein other alternatives exist? And we are seeing this in some rare disease. We are seeing very efficacious non-gene therapy, rare disease therapies that sometimes are very efficacious in a host of different diseases. So if I'm putting on my commercial hat, I'm actually really thinking, like, do we even need this? And if we have reason to believe that there is a section of the patient group that is going to benefit, then that becomes an entire strategy in itself, where we really zero in on these developmental plans. And I think the last bit is a regulatory oversight. Any biologic, any disease, any drug for oncology, rare diseases, immunology is subject to high scrutiny by the FDA, the EMA, and other regulatory bodies. But in case of cell and gene therapy, the scrutiny is higher, and sometimes the dialogue that you need to have with regulators is much more closer and stronger. I don't want to paint this in a negative light, because there's some positives as well. There is a lot of push from the regulators to make it easy for an efficacious and safe therapy to come into market. But this requires an effort and a skill set within teams in a pharma or a biotech company that are more specialized. So that's, I would say, that would be the hurdle. And I think the last one is managing all the stakeholders in the ecosystem when you're getting close to launch and delivery of the drug, because you have perhaps community treaters who are diagnosing the patients, or general physician in some cases, or other specialties outside of oncology and rare who are diagnosing. And there needs to be some sort of an outreach to those folks to ensure that this awareness about this innovative therapy exists. Then you are dealing with patients making decisions as well, being especially in a geography like US, wherein patients are very much in control of their health decisions. And then I think the next one is managing all of the academic center rollout and staff. And just to give a sense, like sometimes ethically, the personnel is delivering a cell therapy, but they're not really employees, or maybe their core incentives are not aligned with the pharma company, which is absolutely, I think, ethically required. But how do you influence without that authority to ensure that your therapy is not given to the patients? And I think that lastly, the physician community, who are sometimes skeptical, sometimes champions, and there is a very layered approach for outreach that is needed to ensure that the questions for each of these particular category of physicians is addressed. And I think ex-US, again, there are different challenges of having, I recall a study that we did at some point wherein biosamples had to be shipped out of a geography, and then that subjects them to more rules and regulations and other hurdles. But then those are things that you need to conquer if you're looking at other geographies as a developer. Like, how much are you going to make this available? And are there geographies which are not open to having biosamples shipped out and shipped in back? So I think there's a lot of like complexity over there. But the good thing is that many drugs are available now, and companies have innovated and have overcome some of these hurdles at least.
I would like to touch upon a point you brought up, Wajiha, because the cost definitely is a concern. And I like what you said, that do we really need these therapies? I think there is no doubt these therapies are great. They're game-changing therapies, but they're so expensive. So before we talk about strategies to bring down the costs and make them more accessible, I'm just out of curiosity, can you give us a specific example where another therapy, a much cheaper therapy, was used and with great results?
With the disclaimer that only quoting what's publicly available, and this is just not something that is testament to what a drug's efficacy for the patient is. I think if you take the example of multiple myeloma, I think we have patients in later lines of therapy who can benefit from cell therapy. But the same patients can actually benefit from a bispecific antibody, which is a much more simpler, off-the-shelf therapy. And I think there are some trade-offs, because sometimes the cell therapy is maybe more efficacious. I wouldn't say way more, but a bit more efficacious. But the trade-offs of less complexity and like less monitoring and better safety and in control. And it's also a known modality. Monoclonal and other antibodies have been around. So I think that's one example wherein perhaps patients who are maybe more healthier and are able to take the complexity of the system are better candidates for cell therapy, and then bispecific cell is a very equally simpler and efficacious option for them. And I think in the rare space as well, like we are looking at some antibody-based therapies in inherited eye conditions, which are almost equaling the response that's afforded by the gene therapies as well.
Hey, smart biotech scientists. I hope you have been enjoying our conversation with Wajiha Ali, who is a strategy expert passionate about bridging the gap between research and commercialization. In part 2, this Thursday, we're continuing our journey and we're talking about how can we make these life-changing therapies more accessible. And to help you navigate the complex journey from the laboratory to the full-scale production, we have designed a comprehensive 90-day program. This program is tailor-made so that you can develop your therapies with peace of mind. And to help you understand if this is what you need, I'm offering you a free, no-obligation assessment. So schedule your call now using the link in the show notes. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.